Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
And I'm Talli Rosenbaum. And today we are going to record our annual questions and answers episode.
We'll get to that in just a moment. First, check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, rate and review, and leave a comment as well. We're also working on additional projects so that Intimate Judaism can expand our reach further. Make sure to tell people about Intimate Judaism and share the podcast so that we can continue to grow our audience. Talli, last year was a very strange year for many, many reasons, and therefore we never got to our Q&A, which is why we're basically starting this year off with this Q&A, and let's jump right in.
Question number 1. I discovered your podcast a few months ago and have been working my way through the episodes. Thank you for producing such a unique resource. Something has been bothering me while listening to your podcast. I finally put my finger on what, and I'd be grateful and interested if you ever managed to work it into an episode. You do an excellent job of making your podcast non-judgmental and accepting of people who do not observe halakha, even while you yourselves regard it as binding. But that non-judgmentalness makes me wonder why I bother observing most of the rules if I could have more fun not doing so and still be a good person. And if, as you keep saying, more people than we realize are not, whether I'm missing out. So to give a specific example of the general point, my wife and I, who have been happily married for more than 5 years, have, when discussing fantasies, shared that we both think it would be fun to have more than 2 people involved in sex. I don't think either of us intended that we would actually do this, but if it was consensual and safe, what would be so bad about it? So what I'd be really interested in is if you ever find an opportunity to discuss this, what case you would make if you were being judgmental for just one episode for why we should keep the halachot about sexual activity, or if you feel that even that would intrude too much on your mission of being non-judgmental, what resources would you point people to?
Okay, Talli, I'll start with this one. There's a side point here which I want to address very briefly in terms of being judgmental, and I appreciate the question, but I think the person who wrote this misunderstands judgmentalism, because I wouldn't say that I'm not judgmental. Perhaps you have something to say about this as well. If someone were to ask me if I think that Jewish law is binding upon all Jews, I would unequivocally say, yes, Jewish law is binding upon all Jews. If a Jewish person were to ask me honestly if I think they should keep halakha, I would say absolutely yes. So in what ways, perhaps, do I not seem judgmental? I think the answer is, as I've probably mentioned before, that there's a difference between acceptance and approval. I can accept that each person has the right to make his or her own decisions. I'm allowed to disagree with those decisions, but I will not posit that God says something about a particular decision because that's not an area I'm ready to go. Again, even though I assert that halakha is binding and that halakha does authentically represent the divine will, I also assert that halakha is not necessarily synonymous with the divine will. In other words, halakha is a subset within God's will, such that everything in halakha is part of Ratzon Hashem, but there are also things, perhaps, within Ratzon Hashem that are outside of halakha too, that can still be called the divine will. That's why I can acknowledge that people in other religious communities can have a real relationship with God, even though they have nothing to do with Jewish law. And I can also acknowledge the possibility, as Rav Shagar has mentioned, that there are things outside of strict halakha that may also be the divine will, even for Jews, although that's a much bigger question for a different time. I just wanted to sort of get that out of the way to make sure that this concept of judgmentalism isn't taken the wrong way. But that's by way of introduction. In terms of the question itself, I think that the best answer I've seen is something that I read by Rav Jonathan Sachs Zatzal in his commentary on the Yom Kippur Machzor, where he explains why on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, we read a section of the Torah dealing with sexual prohibitions. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with the major themes of Yom Kippur. His basic idea is that we believe that the major innovation of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah was Abrahamic monotheism, meaning the idea that there is one God who is involved with the world. But surprisingly, that's not really a major theme of Sefer Bereshit, the first book of the Torah. At least according to the simple meaning, we don't overtly see our ancestors critiquing the religious beliefs of their pagan neighbors. So Rabbi Sachs then says, what is the major difference between the lifestyles of Abraham's family and the pagans among whom they lived? Rabbi Sachs answers that there's one dominant theme that comes up repeatedly, namely, Abraham's family has a real sexual ethic, and the surrounding cultures do not. Wherever we look, the idea of the difference in sexual ethics comes up repeatedly, such as when Abraham is afraid twice that Sarah will be taken into the royal harem, or when Yitzchak fears the same thing regarding Rivka, or when the angels enter Sodom and the population wants to sexually assault them, or when Dinah is raped by Shechem, or when Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Yosef. In all of these cases, the distinction between Abraham's family and the rest of the world is that one side possesses a strong sexual ethic and the other side does not. Rabbi Sachs further notes that it cannot be coincidental, then, that the sign of a covenant is Brit Milah because holiness is directly associated with sexuality. Let me briefly quote Rabbi Sachs himself. Why so? Sexuality is a fundamental theme of ancient myth. There were male gods of power and potency, and female goddesses of fertility and allure, and the relations between them were amoral. They fought, conquered, schemed, and sired. Often they killed one another. At times they killed their own children. It was a world of conflict and betrayal, of sexual lawlessness and enemy. Judaism was and is opposed to this world, whether in its ancient forms of myth or its more modern pseudoscientific or philosophical counterparts. Against this, Judaism sets forth an ethic of love and loyalty, concretized in the idea of covenant, whereby two or more parties, each respecting the integrity of the other, come together in a bond of mutual commitment and fidelity. The human counterpart of the covenant between God and humanity is marriage as a covenant between husband and wife. So what I think this means ultimately is that perhaps the essential feature of our relationship with God is the idea of the brit, the covenant. And sexual ethics are the greatest symbol of the covenant. They're not merely mitzvot, as important as mitzvot are, but defining features of our essential Jewishness. I'll conclude with one more sentence from Rabbi Sachs. He writes, holiness is expressed in our most intimate relationships within the family, in the love that is loyal and generous, self-sacrificing and kind, in the sensitivity of marriage partners to one another and their needs, and in our ability to recognize the integrity of otherness that lies at the heart of love. To me, that's the best answer to this question.
Thank you. So I was going to answer something a little bit similar, but, in my own words or kind of my own way of framing the question and what's coming out from this question. First of all, I do appreciate the question. I do think that we try to present a non-judgmental, open approach to the ongoing conflicts between sexuality and halakha, and that we acknowledge that there are difficulties, and some of those difficulties have to do with not being married and how to navigate your sexuality when you're not married. And some of those difficulties have to do with navigating your sexuality when you are married. And keeping the harchakot, for example, is a difficult thing to do, or abiding with all the laws of Taharat HaMishpacha. So, we do stress that there are difficulties, and we try to validate for people those difficulties because people often feel very, very alone. We look for ways to integrate our commitment to halakha with the actual real, and you'll be able to see more from the questions today, the real conflicts, the real difficulties that arise. It's interesting to me, the kind of framing of, well, now that you're so non-judgmental, why do I even bother? Why should we bother keeping it? I mean, that's really interesting because that cuts to the core of why. Why do we have a commitment? And why do we keep these rules? And also, is there a difference between understanding that some people are not always shomer negiyat completely, and some people do not keep the harchakot completely, and kind of these other areas that we have spoken about, and this idea of, wait a second, there is this concept of ethical non-monogamy, and if two people are consenting, why shouldn't my wife and I bring someone into the bedroom? Well, look, we have debated, you and I, Scott, about doing an episode on this. This has come up, and everything that happens in the real world eventually affects our Orthodox world. And so this question is bound to come up. And what I have to say about this is that this, for me, is really less of a specific halachic question, but it really cuts more to the core of our beliefs and our values and what it means, what sexuality in the framework of Judaism really means. what does it mean to be in a marriage relationship? And I think that, when we talk about the concepts of commitment and exclusivity and sanctity, we learn this from the Kadosh HaKadoshim, one of the most holy sources, Shir HaShirim, where we're looking at the most passionate relationship, which mirrors the relationship between man and woman, lovers, and, it mirrors the relationship of our commitment to God and to, what you talked about in much more eloquent language of Rabbi Sachs about what the breach is all about. And so I think that when we talk about sexuality in the context of Judaism, we are understanding that while monogamy is a difficult concept, it is part of what being Jewish is about. Our relationship with our partner is an extremely important mirror to this idea of non-betrayal. And even if we're talking about ethical non-monogamy, which we can talk about because some of the other questions bring this up as well, we have our own kind of set of ethics. And we also really want to understand, the marriage ceremony, which kind of mirrors the Matan Torah, ve'erastich li le'olam, ve'erastich li b'tzedek, b'mishpat, b'chesed, v'rachamim. I will bind you to me forever. We have a bond, but arastich comes from morasha, moreshet, legacy. And the idea of having a long-term committed relationship is that we create a legacy. And, we don't want to take away the value of sexuality, which is the one thing that we don't do with our friends or with other people. Like we can go out to lunch or go to the movies or, learn Torah or do so many different things with other people. This is the one thing that we only do with our partner. And I think that that's a concept which is fundamental. In fact, during Elul, I spoke about this in a lecture that I gave online for B'Yachad B'Osher, which is an organization that helps couples in marriage education. And I spoke about the concept of relational repair and also commitment. We can put that link in our show notes so that anyone who's interested can listen.
Great. Let's move on to the next question, okay? I have been married for many years and have a family. One thing that I learned recently is that it always has to be dark during intercourse, but it seems to be a real turnoff if the room is black. I know that the light can be switched off at the end, but that's not always practical. Please, can you advise regarding any leniencies regarding light? Let me begin by saying that this is not a Torah law, but the idea of not having sex during the day, specifically during the day, is explicitly mentioned in Masechet Nidah, Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, 17a, and in Masechet Shabbat, Daf Pei Vav Amud Aleph, 86a. It is the practical halacha. And from the rest of the sugya there, it's clear that this doesn't specifically refer to the day per se, but to having light shining on the couple. Meaning it's okay in the day, actually, as long as there's no light shining on the couple. But the idea of having light shining on the couple is the normative halacha. There are various reasons that are given, including, among others, the concern that the husband may see something in his wife which turns him off, or is considered by some to be an aspect of kedusha, of holiness of the Jewish people. However we understand it, the Rambam, who in other cases is broadly lenient when it comes to sex, rules that it is asur, forbidden to have intercourse by the light of a candle. So even those who are generally permissive about other aspects of sexual intercourse are, as far as I know, generally not lenient here. And I'm sorry to say that even if a husband says, I'm not worried about being turned off by seeing my wife, because there are other reasons that are given, the rule fundamentally stands regardless of that particular point. Now, that's not where the story ends, though. So in terms of advice, I can say this. First of all, it's very possible that this prohibition only applies to the act of intercourse itself, which the questioner sort of implied, and very likely not to sexual foreplay, which means that the light just has to be turned off before the act of intercourse. And second of all, some do suggest that the room does not need to be pitch black. Rather, it means you can't have a light shining on you. So if there's a light in the bathroom or the closet or the hallway, as long as you're maintaining privacy, you can't leave the door open if there are other people in the house. That's a different problem. But as long as you're maintaining privacy so that others don't know that you're in the process of having sexual intercourse, then having a light on that's not shining directly on you would be acceptable according to many opinions. That's the basic halacha as I understand it. Perhaps you've heard different things, Talli, but that's how I understand the halacha.
Well, I'll just tell you just from my anecdotal experience, what I find is that more women are annoyed about this than men. And what they get upset about is this idea of, okay, we're going to have sex now and let's turn off all the lights and the room has to be pitch black. And it kind of gives this overall feeling of we're doing something shameful now. We're doing something that we shouldn't be doing. Or, this feels like it has to be done completely in the dark and I shouldn't be able to see you and I shouldn't be able to see your body. And that feels very inhibiting. That feels very inhibiting. And again, most of the people that have complained about this, that I have heard complaining about this, have been women more so than men. I'm not exactly sure why, but it could have to do with this feeling of, hey, I don't want to feel like I'm doing something shameful, and I don't want to feel like you don't want to see my body. I think that sexuality and sexual desire in women particularly, but also in men, is intensified by the fact that their partner is turned on by them and wants to be able to see them. And so I think that even if you want to respect this particular halakha, that, we don't do it with all the lights on or that kind of thing, it can be done in a way that doesn't bring along with it this message of shame or complete darkness because you shouldn't see one another, but rather this is something that we want to do under conditions where it's private and nobody can look in and that kind of thing. It's kind of just reframing the reasoning behind it.
That's very interesting. Okay, that definitely is important to understand, that the question isn't necessarily about the halacha per se, as how is it understood and what does it indicate, and perhaps reframing it accurately, I believe in this case.
Isn't that always the case, though?
Yes, that's very, very true. Okay, Talli, you want to take the next question?
Yeah, sure. Okay. My wife and I have been married for almost 20 years. For the first 15 years of our marriage, we were doing mitzvahs ona the wrong way. We both learned that a woman should be there for her husband and not the other way around. For the last 5 years, we have been doing it right, and I have been there for my wife in every way possible. We have had many long and deep conversations about this, but my wife is still in a very hard place when it comes to intimacy. The 15 years of doing it wrong is really getting in the way of her being able to get where she needs to be in the bedroom. Her therapist suggested that she take a break from intimacy until she feels like she can get over it completely. My wife likes the idea and believes it's a very necessary step for her to get to where she needs to get. The struggle is that she still wants to hug, kiss, cuddle, and sleep together when she is clean, but without having actual intercourse. She wants only the emotional intimacy, and she also doesn't want me ejaculating anywhere near her vagina or even near her for the time being. I'm okay with doing this in order to help her heal, but I don't know if it's possible for me to do it at the same time as cuddling and sleeping together. I know that she needs me to be there for her emotionally and to give her the support she needs to recover. I also know that me doing this for her without ejaculating will lead me to not being there for her emotionally. I listen to all your podcasts, but I don't have who to turn to see what will be allowed in my case and to what extent. I'm just so lost and I don't have what to turn to for guidance. Is there any way you can tell me what's allowed? Yes, I have a Rav whom I ask all my questions, but I've learned the hard way that he isn't emotionally intelligent and very much culturally in the box. I'm really hoping that you can help us get some clarity. Thanks so much in advance. I really like this question. Not that I like the situation, obviously, but unfortunately, it's a very common situation. So I'm going to kind of read between the lines and explain to our listeners what's going on here when he talks about doing it the wrong way. Okay, so when this listener is talking about doing it the wrong way, first of all, I'm going to talk directly here to the person who asked the question. And I want to say that you have really come a long way in understanding. You were taught that sex is something that your wife should provide for you when you want it and when you need it. And you went along with that because you didn't know any better. And now for the past 5 years, you understand that this did damage. This was harmful. This made her feel that she had to have sex with you even when she didn't want to, was too tired, was in pain, etc. So now what's happened is that the part of her brain that perceives threat, it's called the amygdala, it's part of the limbic system in the brain, sees you as a threat because for 15 years, you would come near her and she knew that she would have to have sex with you. So what you're doing now, based on your therapist's advice, being there for her without her feeling obligated to have sex with you, is in fact the treatment. It's a way for the amygdala to no longer perceive you as a threat. And so her need, your wife's needs, to have these boundaries, to say, look, I need you to be able to cuddle with me. I need you to be able to be with me without my feeling that I have to do something that I don't want to do, is the way that I can now perceive you as safe. I can perceive you as somebody who sees me, who sees what my needs are. And eventually I will be able to get to where I want to be, to kind of connect with my own sexual self, because I haven't been able to do that all this time. So that, what I'm hearing, leaves you with a dilemma. And the dilemma is that you obviously, and very naturally and very understandably, get excited when you're with your wife. And you should not feel any shame or embarrassment about the fact that you will likely, on occasion, feel the need to ejaculate. And you also want to be able to respect your wife's needs. And you also don't want to say to her, look, I can't cuddle with you because then I'm going to have to ejaculate. And if you don't let me ejaculate on you or near you, then I'm going to have a sin. That's obviously going to reenact her trauma. And so you are in a dilemma. This is a difficult issue. It has come up. I have written about it. I've written about it and I've spoken to rabbis about it. And it is a very difficult, and you need a rabbi with I guess very broad shoulders. I have had this case and I have heard rabbis, Haredi rabbis, my assumption is that you're Haredi, who have said that in cases like this, don't worry about it. Do what you got to do. I'm not going to speak for the halachic part. That's yours, Scott. So, I'm going to move that part over to you. But I do just want to say kol hakavod to both of you for taking this healing journey together and understanding how important the boundaries are to be able to heal from sexual trauma, because this really is a case of healing from sexual trauma, with your partner who, not on purpose, created that trauma.
Let me try to address this on a halachic level, Talli. And when you say that you've heard Haredi rabbis say that it's okay, I'm not sure what that means. So I'm going to offer two possibilities. If by it's okay, do what you have to do, means that if in the process of cuddling, chibuk v'nishuk, the husband accidentally ejaculates, that I've heard as well. That's not something that he should worry about. He's not intending to do so, but if it happens automatically without his intent, then that's not something which requires repentance. So there we're on the same page. If, however, you mean that you've heard rabbis say that he's allowed to self-pleasure or masturbate, that's something which I have not heard. And I reached out to my friend, Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, the author of the fine book Halachic Positions, to see if he'd heard it either. And he had not. But he did write to me the following, mentioning as well that it does require halachic verification. This is more of a theory. He said, and I'm reading, the only thing I can think of in terms of your original question, and again, speaking about self-pleasuring because the husband cannot ejaculate anywhere near his wife, the only thing I can think of in terms of your question is the Sefer Hasidim, which says that it is, quote-unquote, better to masturbate than to sin sexually in other ways. Perhaps these Haredi rabbis are using that logic, combined with the famous Ezer Mekudash, who says that in modern times, when polygamy is forbidden, masturbation when one's wife is in Nidah, and therefore there's no quote-unquote second wife available, is of lesser severity, albeit not permitted. That is, in the case of a wife who can never have sex, and is therefore perpetually unavailable, the logic would be that masturbation is of a lesser halachically concerning nature, even though it's not permitted per se. I'm not sure what to do with that. I'm not sure if that helps, but when you say that Haredi rabbis have allowed it, I guess it depends on what the it is, and I'm curious to find out if they mean that, yes, masturbation or self-pleasuring is allowed in a situation like this. I am curious to find out what their source is. Okay, let's move on to the next question. I wanted to know if you could do an episode of some sort on when or how to decide that someone has enough kids, and if they are allowed to get a procedure to make sure that they do not get pregnant again. Please keep me updated if you can do something like this. This question can be understood in different ways. I am going to emphasize that concept of procedure. So let me quickly talk about the halachot of this. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about in terms of the therapeutic side, what it means if a person doesn't want to have kids and wants to get this procedure, but I'm going to speak purely on a halachic level. So regarding the man, let me make it clear that a vasectomy is prohibited by Torah law based on Vayikra Perek Kaf Bet, Pasuk Kaf Daled 22-24. For women, active and direct sterilization is prohibited by rabbinic decree. Now, indirect sterilization, such as drinking some sort of medication which causes sterilization, is permitted in very specific circumstances when she would otherwise be allowed or mandated to use birth control in very specific cases, and other forms of birth control are not possible. The question is whether tubal ligation is considered indirect or direct sterilization, and that's actually an argument among modern poskim. So, for example, Rav Nachum Rabinovich rules leniently, and Rav Moshe Feinstein prohibits it. Rav Eliezer Melamed explains the logic behind saying that tubal ligation would be indirect, because it doesn't look indirect. It looks like it's a direct form of sterilization. He says, number one, it's not visible. Second of all, it can be reversed. And third of all, even if it's not reversed, eggs can still be extracted from the ovaries and implanted via IVF. On the other hand, it is a surgical procedure, and because of that, Rav Moshe Feinstein rules that it's forbidden. So the answer halachically seems to be that according to all opinions, tubal ligation is not an acceptable form of birth control if, in a situation where birth control is halachically warranted, other things like the pill can be used. If they can't, some would allow tubal ligation, again, not a vasectomy though, but only for what we can term a very strong halachic reason, such as extreme discomfort during pregnancy and birth or various genetic issues. I believe that almost everyone would agree that tubal ligation, only because they just don't want to have kids, is halachically prohibited.
Okay, well, I've got nothing to add, so I think we can move on. First of all, I want to thank you, since your podcast is what got me and my husband through Shana Rishona. Baruch Hashem, we have been married just over a year now. I listened to your episode on Taharas HaMishpacha, straining marriage. I am writing to you since I feel I have nowhere else to turn. I humbly ask you to read every word of what I'm about to say for any women who feel the same, are too afraid of being judged to speak up. I'm aware of the halachot and follow them, but I absolutely loathe them. I hate becoming Nidah and suddenly being not allowed something as simple as passing me the water. I fail to see how that leads to having sex. Please let me know if you find someone who gets off on that. I hate having to be mindful not to pass things at a Shabbos meal full of people. I hate having my basic human need for physical reassurance from my husband dismissed outright. I hate having to do invasive bedikot that are often uncomfortable and worrying about every random shade of orange, yellow, or pink that leaves me questioning everything from my judgment of what colors look like to basic trust in myself for anything. I hate bringing my underwear to a rabbi to clarify if those patches are blood or skid marks. Pray tell me why any other man besides my husband should have a say in my bedroom. He simply has no right. It's invasive and humiliating. Why should I go through all this just for the right to receive a hug from my own husband? I hate the anxiety, humiliation, removal of autonomy, and invasion of privacy Nidah brings for me. I hate obsessing over every random piece of preparation for mikvah, doing things twice to make sure I know I did it and did it correctly. Did I bathe long enough? Did the bath water get everywhere? Is my dry skin a chatzitza? Why is a natural process that I was created with impure, and that is somehow my problem? People say this mitzvah is so beautiful, but how are we so quick to forget that this is Chava's curse, that frankly should have been paid off by now, and additionally not my problem, as I wouldn't be born for another 5,000 years. I had no say in this. All of it is driving me insane and affecting my overall mental health. There is no happiness in the mitzvah for me, and it's quickly spreading to other facets of my Judaism. Is there any way I can possibly fix this without any cheesy emunah speeches that make me feel inadequate? Okay. You're handing it right over to me, huh?
Well, I mean, the truth matter is, maybe I'm good at cheesy emunah speeches, but I feel bad. I just want to say one point, which is that I'm not quite sure if this is a question about simply disliking the halacha or when it becomes a mental health issue, that there's actually something here beyond simply not being happy with the halacha. And in that case, it's pretty important that the questioner speak to somebody, either a mental health expert or a rabbi who is well-versed in the halachot that involve mental health. For example, Rav Yoni Rosenzweig has a whole organization that deals with mental health and halacha. I'm not saying that that's what's going on over here, but I think that it's important to realize that. And the second thing I'm going to say is that the questioner understandably makes certain assumptions about what's required in halacha, which isn't necessarily always the case. To give one very, very basic example, halachically, it's true. You need to do 15 bidikot generally before going to the mikvah. One is a hefsek tahara, and then twice a day for 7 days during the Shiva Nikiyim. However, if one does not do that and only does the hefsek tahara and one on the first day and one on the last day, and perhaps even less than that, b'diavad, after the fact, it's acceptable. I'm not saying that answers the question at all. It's kind of almost avoiding the question by saying there are leniencies. The person should know, however, that because there are certain things that are leniencies in certain situations, maybe don't always assume that everything is exactly as you think it is. If you can find a Rav who is well-versed in these halachot, perhaps he can make it at least easier for you.
Thanks for that. I have a few things that I want to comment on this. I appreciate that you mentioned mental health, and I understand why you might have done that. And she does say, all of this is driving me insane and affecting my overall mental health. But I also want to normalize that this is the case for many, many, many women around Nidah. Like a lot of women find it extremely difficult and extremely annoying. You're not alone. And I think part of the problem is that it's often presented in a very idealized way. And in fact, today, I think that there's a lot more presentation of this as realistically not so ideal and often very difficult. And the hadracha that was given, certainly in my day, which is that this is so wonderful and, this enhances your marital life. I think today hadracha is given more realistically that it is difficult to do. That's number one. I appreciate what you said, Scott, about making assumptions. I think that this young woman isn't making assumptions. This is what she was taught. And, I have a feeling too that this young woman is generally perfectionist about things, like, generally her whole life. I'm going to say this to you who's written the letter. My guess is that your whole life, you've been pretty good at following the laws. You haven't had too much trouble. This is the kind of thing that they say that when you learn Taharat HaMishpacha, you know what it's like to be a Baal Tshuva, because with kosher and Shabbat and everything that we do, we've done from the time we're little babies. But this is something that you don't do until you're when you get married and then you're an adult already, and then you're introduced to a whole set of rules that you have to kind of integrate into your identity. And it's very hard to integrate this into your identity. So for you, for example, this might be the first time that you're actually confronting a set of halachot that feel very emotionally oppressive, that feel like they're really overtaking your sense of autonomy. And look, I think that at the end of the day, what Rabbi Scott said about looking for leniencies can be extremely helpful. But in addition to that, I think that we also sometimes have to make our own decisions about how we're able to keep the laws in a way, that it says v'chai b'hem. And I think it's important to communicate. It's important to communicate with your husband about how these laws are affecting you and how do you want to be able to agree on keeping these laws in a way that you don't continue to feel so oppressed by them. I would say that no system is perfect. We're all kind of identified with the lives that we're in, but we want to be able to make them work for us in as much a way as we can. Otherwise, we're going to end up rejecting the whole thing. So if we don't want to reject the whole thing, and you said, like, this is impacting other areas of your Judaism. And so what you want to be able to do is practice your Judaism in a way that you can identify, in a way that you can feel that you are Jewish with integrity and not with a feeling of oppression. And so I do think that talking to somebody about this, a mental health professional, can be helpful. Talking to a Rav like Rav Yoni, who understands the impact of being so adherent that you're in a conflict. You're in a conflict between the parts of you that are very committed to doing everything right and the parts of you that feel very oppressed by this. And so I do think that talking to somebody further can be helpful. And I'm not talking about cheesy Emunah speeches.
Okay, very good. Mm-hmm. Let's go on to the next question. You've discussed what to share and what not to share with kids about Nidah observance, how to handle them noticing Ima going out to the mikvah, separated beds, etc. I'm in the opposite situation. For almost 4 years, my wife has had an IUD and hasn't had Nidah. My daughter, now 12, said her menahelet, that means this head of the school, said Imas go to the mikvah every month. Does Ima do that? I do want to be age-appropriately open about Taharat HaMishpacha, and it's something we observe, but practically we haven't for years. So I told her that yes, Ima goes to the mikvah every month, because in theory, she does. Any words of wisdom?
Yeah, look, I think that you did the right thing, and I'll tell you why. Your daughter doesn't need to know all the details. Your daughter is really just asking for reassurance that her parents do what other parents do and what they're supposed to do. And you gave her that without going into all the details that are not of concern for her. We do follow the rules of Taharat HaMishpacha, and that includes going to the mikvah when it's appropriate to go. And not a lot more needs to be said. So I think that you handled that and you don't really need any words of wisdom. You are wise here. The next question. Is one allowed to read or watch something to get in the mood for physical intimacy? Do you know of any articles that discuss if any media are halakhically permitted to read or look at if one needs to get in the mood for physical intimacy? Please assume in the question that the shalom bayit emotional intimacy is not the issue.
I found this question to be very interesting, and I'd like to cite Rav David Stav, who offers several sources for the prohibition of looking at women for the sake of getting physical pleasure through looking. There are actually 3 biblical sources of this idea of tumat einayim, not looking at women with the aim of getting sexual pleasure from looking. The first one is from Vayikra 18, Yudchet, Lo tikruvu legalot erva, v'ra'a et ervata. That means don't come close to revealing her nakedness, and then a bit later, and thereby seeing her nakedness. The fact that this verse uses the term looking, v'ra'a, even though the point is doing a forbidden sexual act, indicates that there's a problem in gazing as well. That's the first thing. The second source for not looking is v'lo tatur acharei einechem, don't follow after your eyes, which we say is part of Kriyat Shema. It's from the 15th chapter of Bamidbar. And the third source is from Devarim Kaf Gimel 23, Nishmarta mikol davar ra. You should be careful from any evil thing. Those are the 3 sources which typically are understood as the reasons that we're not allowed to look at something which is sexually alluring. Rav Stav says, after analyzing the sources, that there are 3 different types of male gaze with 3 different types of halachic ramifications. Number 1, looking for the sake of getting pleasure, which is prohibited potentially by Torah law. Number 2, paying attention to a woman's beauty, even if not for the sake of getting sexual pleasure out of looking. He said that's generally prohibited with some exceptions. And number 3, looking without paying attention to beauty or trying to get pleasure, which is permitted. That means, when you're in the supermarket, you don't have to turn your head away and not look. Now, there's an interesting halakhic question about looking at a picture on a screen, whether that's also considered forbidden gazing according to Rav Stav. And according to Rav Stav, and he's not the only opinion, looking at women on a screen, meaning through a phone or a computer screen or a TV, is not the first 2, lo taturu or lo tikruvu, but if it's done for the sake of pleasure, it would be a violation of the third pasuk, b'nishmarta b'kol davar ra. This obviously is a much bigger halachic conversation. I'm just giving you the Roshei Prakim, the basic ideas over here. So it seems to me, and there may be other opinions, though I have not seen them, that there isn't really a leniency. There is not really a leniency if someone's looking at a movie or a magazine in order to arouse his desire. I'm speaking about men now. And I'd like to read a passage in the Rambam from Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah in the 5th chapter, the 9th halacha. I'll translate it in English right now. Someone who sees a woman and becomes sick, lovesick, and he is dying from his lovesickness, and the doctors say the only way that he could be healed is by having sex with her. Better that he die and not have sex with her, even if she is not married. Even to speak with her from behind a barrier. The Rambam says we don't teach him to do this. Better that he die and we don't teach him to speak with her from behind this barrier, so that we don't treat the daughters of Israel like they're hefker, like they're ownerless, like anything can be done with them. And this thing will later lead to violate laws of sexuality. That's not what we're talking about over here, but this does speak to a certain idea of what we might now, using a modern terminology, objectification of women. And that objectification of women, again, not using terms that the Rambam necessarily would have used, but that we can use, is something which is not allowed, even if it's to keep the man alive, and how much more so if it's just to enhance pleasure. So that's my general feeling about this. I also want to say there's another issue, which is there's a halachic problem as well about thinking about somebody not your own spouse during sex. In fact, midrashically, there's a tradition that Reuven's problem, Reuven, the son of Yaakov, his problems with tzniut that we see later on in his life, there is a tradition that actually is connected to the fact that when Yaakov got married to Rachel, it actually was Leah. He thought he was sleeping with one woman, but he actually was sleeping with her older sister. And according to tradition, Reuven was born from that first initial interaction between Yaakov and Leah. And there is a tradition that because Yaakov wasn't thinking about Leah, that affected his offspring, that affected Reuven. Now, I'm not saying this is literally true. I'm not trying to talk about historically here, but I'm talking about the idea that Chazal are telling us there is a concept of not thinking about somebody other than your wife during intercourse. It would seem to me that would also relate to this too. If someone is looking at a Playboy magazine or porn, or even just a rated R movie and enjoying gazing at another woman, that could impact the fact that he's now thinking about someone other than his wife during intercourse. So bottom line, from what I've seen, I don't see a way to be lenient in this particular matter. If someone has seen otherwise, because I'm not going to pretend that I've done a comprehensive investigation of all the sources, I'd appreciate hearing from you.
I have many things to say about that, starting with the fact that Yaakov didn't love Leah. He actually loved Rachel. But it is an interesting midrash. And also the Rambam is very interesting because, look, from what we know, nobody's ever died from not having sex with somebody. But I think the Rambam, it's his way to really have difficulty with this idea of dysregulation. He wants everything to be done with some rationality, with some balance, with some thought. And this idea that you have to have sex with somebody because you're going to die otherwise seems like it would be very anathema to him. Also because of the objectification issue, which I appreciate you raising. I do want to point out that it's interesting to me that it seems like your assumption was that this was written by a man, when in fact my assumption was that it was written by a woman. But my question to you is if your answer would be different if it in fact were written by a woman.
That's an interesting question. I think that presumably the laws are somewhat different for women, though I don't really know. That's something which we probably should talk about in a different episode. Have you heard anything about this in your practice?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I definitely have seen a lot of leniency amongst rabbis, also Haredi rabbis, and even encouragement for women to look at any kind of romantic or erotic material that would help them to kind of get into the mood or to connect with their sexuality, because traditionally women have been less connected with their own sexuality than men.
Because it's interesting for me, I'm thinking about it in terms of the biblical sources that Rav Stav provides. There are certain mitzvot which Masachet Sotah, the Mishnah says, don't apply to women, lo taseh, prohibitions, and these are not among them. Presumably these apply to women, but at the same time, I have also heard that the laws of Tumat Einaim don't apply to women in the same way. I'm curious, and I don't know the answer, I'm curious why scripturally it's different, because according to the basic understanding of Masachet Sotah, it shouldn't be different, but practically and halachically, I believe it is different. Like, here's a good example. There's a Gemara Masachet Brachot that says that Rabbi Yochanan, who was apparently very, very handsome, used to sit outside of the mikveh in order to have the women who'd walk by be inspired by his beauty in order to have relations with their husband or in order to have beautiful children, whatever it means exactly. The Gemara says that people asked him, aren't you worried about the Yetzer Hara? And he says, no, I think of them as geese, not as women. Fine, however we understand that. But it doesn't say, aren't you worried that the women will have a Yetzer Hara? So at least from this admittedly non-halachic Gemara, it seems that it's not a problem for them to look at him. The problem was him looking at them, at least in principle.
Well, to move to sexual science, for example, men are considered to be very visual, such that visual stimulus, such as just looking at their wives, may be sufficient for them for the most part, unless they are dealing with their own issues. Whereas for women, they often need this idea of fantasy, of thinking about things. They may be visual as well, but in different ways. And what you said before about how you're not allowed to think about somebody else, I do want to point out that this particular, prohibition can be very, very inhibiting, because sexuality is very much based often on ideas. And, it's in your brain. We think about sex as being part of the sex organ, but the most important sex organ is the brain. And so this idea of what it is that stimulates the desire for sex, there are many, many different factors that go into that. And among those are thoughts about sex and fantasies and images and things that you might have read in a romance novel. So it's kind of difficult to isolate just one variable and say, no, only use this variable as a factor. It's kind of like saying, if you're going to compare this to food, which I don't love to do, but, don't get your appetite from walking past a Treif restaurant and smelling it. You can only get your appetite from the food that your wife cooks, for example. And that's kind of difficult. You can't help it.
I presume the question then would largely be something that you do actively and intentionally versus something that happens passively over which you don't have control.
Exactly. That's a good point. One other thing I want to mention is that sometimes there may be couples that feel like watching something together will help them to get into the mood, which is different than kind of getting your appetite somewhere else, so to speak.
Right. I'm not sure halachically that would change things, but perhaps on a therapeutic level it changes things. I don't know. Should we move on to the next question?
Yes, please go ahead and ask it.
Quite typically, Chatan and Kala lessons are structured as a course leading up to the wedding. Lessons often focus on the laws of family purity and maybe on sex and intimacy. I'm sure teachers are available for follow-up questions and consultation after the wedding day. But why is this only when asked for? Isn't there something wrong with teaching theory leading up to a wedding with no structured follow-up after marriage? When you learn to drive, you learn the theory, and then routinely instructors or parents give ongoing mentoring. A student doctor doesn't learn from classes and then is handed a scalpel and wish good luck. No, she has lessons before and after the practical and during, but we don't expect this with sex. So why can't a chatan or kala teacher structure their course, as a matter of routine, to have continuation of lessons after the couple starts with intimacy? Surely that way the lessons will have more relevance.
You're a chatan teacher, so why don't you start with the question, and then I can offer something. Do you have anything to say about this?
Yeah, first of all, I agree with everything that the questioner asked. I will say in defense of those who do not follow up, which is that many teachers, and I can only speak personally about chatan teachers, but I think many teachers see their job as not talking about sex per se, but as teaching the halachot of Nidah, of Taharat Mishpacha, and what is permitted and forbidden in the bedroom. They don't see themselves as sex or couple therapists, and frankly, they're not trained as sex or couple therapists. So perhaps be careful what you wish for. There might be a whole lot of bad information if people who are rabbis are not trained to do more, and they decide to consider themselves an experts where they decidedly are not. Unfortunately, I think, as I've mentioned before, Talli, this is an ongoing problem where sometimes rabbis believe their own PR and think they understand more than they actually do in areas where they are not trained. Not all, obviously. Plenty of rabbis know exactly what they can and cannot do. Some, however, think they might be experts in sex when they just are not that. So the problem isn't necessarily that we need rabbis to do more follow-up. It's that we need more chatan and kala teachers to have more training and then do follow-up if possible. So I agree, there should be follow-up. We also have to decide what exactly is the role of a chatan or a kala teacher. Is it to teach the laws, which is what most think it is? Or is it also to teach them the rudimentary ideas of sexual relations with a wife or a husband, which maybe it also is? And once we decide what the job is, if it does involve more than giving the halachot, which I think is a healthy thing, in that case, yes, of course, there should be follow-up. I think that would be a smart thing.
So as is my way, I'm going to kind of hone in on the questioner here, because my guess is that this particular questioner really felt lost. They felt lost. They didn't feel like they had anybody to talk to about what they were experiencing. And I often hear this. I often hear kind of like negativity around, why didn't my college teacher ask me how it was going? College teachers, I don't know so much about chatan teachers, but them as well. But a lot of college teachers, they get a lot of flack. Whatever they do is wrong. If they do ask, it's invasive. Why are you butting into my sex life? If they don't ask, it's abandoning. Why did they not care? If they talk too much about sex, why did they tell me all that? Why did they say all that? If they didn't talk enough about it, why didn't they? So often college teachers and chatan teachers, because they're providing a service and it's not directed towards the person or the couple, generally speaking. It's educational. And so you're not customizing to what the person needs. And so some couples may actually very much appreciate follow-up, and some couples may actually find that invasive. And this is why I think that any kind of hadracha with couples or with individuals should be more inclusive in terms of, this is how I do it. How would you want it? How would you want? And kind of have some sort of beginning contract to see if it's even a good shidduch, because not every kala instructor is going to be good for the person who is learning from them. And this is really a whole episode.
Like many of these questions.
Exactly. I kind of put these two questions together because I think that the theme of these questions, the theme I would say is couples therapy versus sex therapy. So the first question is, I have a question and I was wondering if I can get your opinion. I'm a married person, Orthodox Jewish, for over 10 years. We have children, Baruch Hashem. My wife is the one who is experiencing low libido. However, even though we are working with a regular therapist, she's not fully ready for seeing a sex therapist. Although she's been trying to help herself, she thinks the chances are very low of her achieving positive results. Meanwhile, I'm waiting for her to be ready to see a sex therapist together. Do you think that I should see a sex therapist by myself, and would it be beneficial? What are the benefits of that? Maybe you can address it on your next show. Thanks, and keep up the good work. And then the other question is, I'm a big fan of your podcast and have been listening to one episode after another. I appreciate the work that both of you are doing to discuss important topics in a forum that is comfortable for and respectful of frum Jews. I know you recently did your Q&A podcast, so this question is a year old. My apologies for sending this question now. My question is really for Talli. I was wondering how you know whether a sex therapist or a couples therapist could be more helpful. For background, my husband and I have been having issues for a while now, which obviously impacts our intimate relationship. For him, the lack of sex is the main issue. But for me, it's about a lack of communication, emotional support, which makes me not want to be intimate with him. I would love for someone to explain to him that it's normal for women to need her emotional needs to be met first in order to feel comfortable having sex with that person. There's obviously a lot more to this, but that's the gist. Now, this is interesting because the husband could have written the first, it could have been the
So maybe
one
it's the same couple,
couple.
right?
Same couple. Like he's writing and saying the problem is sex. She doesn't want to have sex and she needs a sex therapist. And she's saying, no, the problem is our emotional intimacy. We need a couples therapist. And he needs to understand that if we don't have emotional intimacy, I'm not going to be in the mood. So, I think that this is also cuts to the core of this issue of couples therapy versus sex therapy. Is this a sexual functioning problem, or is this a problem that stems from difficulties within the dynamic of the marriage? And again, it could be. It could be. It might not be. It might be a part of it. Usually it is a part of it, but often it's not. Often there are other issues at play. The big question is when you go to a couples therapist, the couples therapist should be trained to be able to talk about sex. If you're going to a sex therapist, the sex therapist should be well trained in the dynamics of couples therapy, different types of modalities for couples therapy, because obviously you need to be able to take all of it into consideration. Even the whole idea of going to a couples therapist and then going to a sex therapist, I don't do that. If somebody's already in couples therapy, I'm not going to just do the sex part. I find that that's splitting, and I want to be able to work with the marital dynamic, with all aspects of things. But I do understand that some couples therapists don't feel comfortable getting into aspects of the bedroom. It's also an issue of function. If you are having erectile problems or you're having difficulties reaching orgasm, it makes sense to go to a sex therapist who's trained in treating sexual function problems. But a lot of couples that come to me aren't having difficulties with their sexual function. It's just that the sex is not worth having, or that there are difficulties in the relationship, or that there are kind of assumptions about one another. So I kind of think that it doesn't really matter that much. I think that a good therapist, a good couples therapist, or a good sex therapist needs to be able to work with all of those different variables of sexuality within a relationship, including the relational variables and including the variables of what's going on in the emotional intimacy. Well, how are you triggering each other? What are the childhood wounds? What are your assumptions? What are your entitlements? What's your dance around intimacy? These are all things that should be spoken about in the therapy room.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Going through the Beis Yaakov system, I can't say I was taught this outright, but it seemed understood that Nidah and the laws that relate to it are mostly a woman's domain, Nidah being one of the 3 mitzvot given to women. Of course, there needs to be discussion and consent from both parties, but things like meticulousness about counting or bedikas and preferences related to harchakot, etc., the woman generally has the last word regarding her comforts. This always made sense to me, as it's her body that determines whether the couple is in a Nidah state, and she is the one more actively involved in the bidikot, going to the mikveh and so forth. I always viewed this area very differently from other halachic decisions in a household, such as kashrut or Shabbos standards, because those are less personal to a woman, so naturally both partners would have equal weight when making those decisions. Is this viewpoint incorrect? And further, do men and women have different roles when it comes to making Nidah-related decisions? This is an interesting question. I'm not quite sure, Talli, how to answer it. I'm curious what you would say about it. My general feeling is that there are 2 separate points that need to be made. One is that women do have a greater say in terms of determining whether a bedika is clean or not. We say this is a type of witnessing, a type of testimony of sort, which a woman is trusted on. And if a woman says that it's clean, the husband trusts his wife. That's something which actually is an important point. It's her decision to decide if this needs to go to the rabbi and so forth. It doesn't mean that she can make it up, but we trust that she knows what her own body, she knows what she's looking at, and therefore that does belong to the woman's domain, so to speak. In terms of the rest, though, deciding how a couple relates to various harchakot or what they do when the couple is in Nidah or not in Nidah, I don't personally see that as being more one spouse's or the other. I think that's something which involves conversation, something which they have to decide together. When I did teach Chatan classes, I always said, when it comes to things that some people do this and some people do that, or there are different opinions, that's something which involves a conversation between the husband and wife together. It's not something which one can impose upon the other. If it does, that's probably pretty unhealthy. It has to be something which involves a conversation so that they're both on the same page. So there are 2 separate points. And with this, I'll conclude. When it comes to looking at the B'dika, for example, and specific things that involve the woman's body per se, yeah, that's her decision and it's her determination. When it comes to how they act during Nidah or not during Nidah, that's something which involves a conversation. And I don't think it's specifically more one side or the other. One thing I'll just point out, a slight correction, Nidah being one of the 3 mitzvot given to women, women were given many, many mitzvot. There is a Mishnah in Masachet Shabbat which says that women die in childbirth because of 3 specific problems, Nidah, Chala, and Hadlakat Haner. I think that probably is what she's referring to. Just, it's not that women only have 3 mitzvot. It's 3 mitzvot that we say are specifically related to women in that particular way, however we understand what Chazal were saying.
I completely agree with that assessment. And I also want to point out that different couples are different. And many, many women do not want their husbands involved in reminding them to do the b'dikot or asking them if they did their b'dikot or asking, like, they just want to be left alone. Trust me, I want to be trusted on this. And these are the same women who, if their husband comes into the kitchen and says, oh, is that a milchik pot that you're cooking? There are people like that, and they'll understand that, they just got to put up with that because, they have an anxious partner or he's worried or whatever it is. But when it comes to this, they might say, you know what, don't ask me these questions. This is my domain. I'm on it. And trust me. And if I have a question, I will ask my yoetzet, and please leave this to me. And there are other couples, though, where the woman will say, look, I don't want this all to be on me. And I want my husband to remind me, and I want my husband to take my cloth to be examined, or I want that type of relationship around Nidah. Just as with everything else, we can't make a general statement, but I do think that differentiation of Nidah being different than Shabbat and Kashrut, because it's the woman's body and she needs to take autonomy over it. I do think that there is some value to that. Let's quickly do 2 more questions. Thank you for speaking about sexual discrepancies. I've written before about the fact that I, as the wife, have much more desire, libido, and need for sex than my husband. It feels very isolating that so much is said about how men have more need and desire and less about women. Can you address that? Stating that you know that it exists is not enough. We higher desire, women need more. My husband may feel stigma, but so do I. That and rejection. We have a lovely life full of friendship, respect, and joy, and I am mourning that I will never have the sex life I desire. We've been to treatment with a skilled sex therapist with minimal improvement. If I weren't religious, I would explore an open marriage. You know what? I think we need to do a whole episode on this. First of all, I want to validate your pain. It sounds like it is so hard. And just as hard as it is for you to feel that you're not getting your sexual needs met, it is also hard for men with low desire to feel that they're not able to meet their partner's sexual needs. But it's really, really hard to navigate sexual discrepancies because we don't ever want to get into coercion or into obligatory or unwanted sex, whether you're the man or whether you're the woman, if you feel obligated to have sex. And I do realize that on a halachic level, men are much more mandated to please their wives when they want. But this can also lead to, and I see this in my practice, I have men who have felt like sexually abused in their marriages from their wives' high desire for sex, or whether it's emotional or physical needing. I think we do have to recognize that just as women can feel victimized by coercion, so can men. And we also have to realize that just as men can feel the pain and rejection of not being wanted, so can women. The last thing about if we weren't religious, I would explore an open marriage. I think that we opened up our Q&A with this idea of open marriage. It's possible that we really need to do a whole episode on that as well. But, again, I think that our points of view about this on a basically fundamental level is clear, but we do recognize that this is coming up. And if it's coming up, we do need to address it.
Okay, Talli, as is your appropriate want, you address the specific questioner. I'm going to talk about something implicit in the question, even though I'm not dealing with the validation, which is obviously the most important part over here. I think that there is a mistaken assumption. And by the way, this mistaken assumption is not of the questioner. I think it's probably the mistaken assumption, getting back to a previous question, of many Chatan teachers, maybe Kala teachers as well, which is that men have greater desire, have a greater Yetzer Hara than women do. And I think that is something which is not necessarily true in sources, both Jewish and otherwise. I just want to note that people often say this, the Chatanim have a much stronger desire than women. I don't know where that would come from in Jewish sources per se, though Jewish sources are not univocal. There are many different opinions. I will say that the assumption that men have a greater libido is not necessarily universal. I'm going to talk about the ancient Greeks, led by Aristotle, as well as Romans. They assumed that women have a stronger sexual desire than men. In fact, the misogynist poet Juvenal, a Roman poet who died in 128, he wrote a series, Talli, of satirical poems called the Satires. In his sixth satire, just to show you how people thought almost 2,000 years ago, he recommends that men only have intercourse with boys because you can never satisfy a woman's sexual desire, but you can satisfy a boy or a man's sexual desire.
There are volumes and volumes and volumes on this idea of sexual desire and how it was seen in ancient times and what happened with the Puritanism and the Victorian era. And, there's so much historical and social response on desire discrepancies that we could do a whole series.
And I think that people trying to now say, oh, yeah, men have a greater desire, as if that's always been the case and the way always people thought about it, it's just not true. What probably is true, I would say, though, is that at least as seen in Hilchot Nidah, in the laws of Taharat HaMishpacha, Jewish thought, or at least Jewish law, largely see women not necessarily having less desire, but being better able to control their desire. We see this because there are certain things that men cannot do that women are allowed to do, because we're less concerned about a woman controlling her desire and jumping into bed with her husband than we are with the men doing the same. So I would say that that's a different question about desire. That's more about an ability of self-control. So there I would say that at least with regard to Nidah, Jewish law generally sees women as having more self-control, but not necessarily less desire.
Lots of interesting things to say. Do you want to read the last question?
Okay, the final question for today. Recently, there has been an outcry against two frum lesbians having a civil marriage. The podcast has spoken about homosexuality, but it's always been oriented around male homosexuality. Can you speak about lesbianism and how that relates to halacha on your show? That's a very big question, Talli.
I think we need to do an episode on that. Let's plan one for this season.
Let's table that for now and deal with it in an appropriate setting, an entire episode.
It's an important subject.
Well, Talli, that does it for today.
This was fun.
Please continue to send us your questions because we will do another Q&A at some point, hopefully in the near future. We apologize if we didn't get to your question. It's partially a matter of time and partially a matter of trying to use the questions that are most universally applicable. However, all questions matter, and if you'd like to send it in again, please do so. Thank you so much for listening. Remember to go to the website, intimatejudaism.com. Remember to subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcast, rate and review, and leave a comment. And thank you for joining us.
Bye.